It's a great honor to address this distinguished assembly of colleagues and friends. I'm sincerely glad that such a large number of participating countries responded to the call of the organizers to get one step closer to the harmonious, inclusive society that the modern world so desperately needs. This year's theme of the conference is to discuss one of the aspects of the sustainable development of communities, local, national and global, in terms of their readiness to be inclusive. However, the events currently taking place in the world have expanded the concept of inclusion and accordingly raised the goals of today's conference to a higher meaningful level, when the concept of inclusion goes beyond its traditional meaning and becomes indeed a challenge for all of us regarding the right to be called Homo sapiens or wise man. I myself went through a similar transitional path in relation to inclusion. Having taken over responsibility for a special boarding school for children with developmental disabilities, I faced the problem of a lack of knowledge and skills in educating and cooperating with people who were different from me. Being careful not to harm these children by some misguided actions, I gladly responded to the call to join the team of professionals from inclusive practices. Here, I came to know more profoundly the principles of work and life of my new partners. I realized that my initial approach needed to change. Treating a child with special needs in a professional inclusive practice way is very good, but it is not sufficient for them just to be included. Providing the conditions both for their daily living and development of their spirit so that these children do not have barriers related to their disabilities is the minimum that must be achieved. Moreover, working with the school community within the walls of the school was only the beginning, since the elimination of many of their problems was related to the impact of a wider level society. This, let's call it the macro aspect of inclusion, motivated me to get to know the International Association for Community Development and their International Community Development Practices Standards, which turned out to be universal and, moreover, very close to the goals of the sustainable development of humanity as a whole. Dear conference participants, I discovered the long-known truth that everything in this world is interconnected. Therefore, my impact upon the life of the resident of a rural special boarding school of our gathering today, the World Community Development Conference, can be as decisive and valuable as the impact of that child on the development of our national or global communities in the future. But this is possible only on the condition that society will sustain its development, providing opportunities to all its members and supporting their abilities and talents for the benefit of humanity. This moment, in my opinion, is the bridge that connects inclusion in its narrow and broader sense. After all, what is inclusion in reality? It is openness and accessibility for everyone. Since English is the main underlying language for most of the conference participants, let's refer to the Oxford English Dictionary, which currently consists about 600,000 words and is considered to be the most complete academic dictionary. It defines inclusion as the fact of including someone, the fact of being included in a broader sense, or the provision of equal opportunities in a narrower sense. Both definitions mean that inclusion is in fact one of the humanities' tests for the level and degree of its own development. Since the majority of international documents which are ratified by national states clearly indicate that there is no alternative to the society of equal opportunities, it can be claimed that we have already passed this test as being declared. No one in civilized communities today would accept restrictions of rights of opportunities based on nationality, religion, skin color, gender, etc. So in theory, we are ready for the global inclusive community, but the level of practical application of these norms, unfortunately, may still differ. And this is a challenge for us that we cannot ignore. Speaking about the problems of inclusion as an access to equal opportunities, I want to draw attention to the fact that all levels of communities from the grassroots to the global should be taken into account. At the grassroots level, this will mean that same opportunities for all members of the community, for example, when relatively speaking schools or university students with disabilities are involved in all processes and activities together with their able peers. At the global level, this means that involvement of all national communities in the process of the coexistence and constructions of long-term plans for the development of humanity. As to the application of equal opportunities for the development and existence of these communities, this, as you know, is not always promising. In order not to delve deeper into the theory, I will only emphasize that there can be measure levels when it comes to the inclusion in certain processes by territorial, ethnic, occupational and other communities. All these questions need their solutions, which is a measure of the correctness of our path. What are the challenges when building a truly inclusive society? There are many, and among these are both the objective, at least situational, and the subjective barriers. I would classify finance, or lack of it, as one of the objective barriers, which is often decisive. It is not secret that inclusion of people with special needs often requires extra resources, which is not always possible. There are many prosperous countries and there are poor ones, so their ability to create certain conditions for their population will naturally differ. The same can be said about the different levels of wealth between members of the national community. The services that are financially available for one person will remain only a dream for another. Another conditional objective challenge is the traditions and beliefs of any given national or territorial community. There are the stereotypes and mindsets established by previous generations, which are often very difficult and sometimes dangerous to change. At the same time, in my opinion, the main barriers to creating an inclusive society are the subjective reasons that lie within the sphere of our influence. For example, the misunderstanding of the importance of inclusion by governmental and public institutions, as well as individual members of society. Often, it is not necessary to attract serious funds or adopt peculiar piece of legislation. It is enough to simply offer a hand, a helping one, to greet, to be the first to approach, to talk, to smile. At the time, gaining my first experience from talks with the children from the special boarding school I referred to earlier, I was amazed by their interests and inspirations. The boys told me about the fancy cars they saw in the movies. The girls dreamed of becoming models, the magazine clippings of which they carefully kept among their few treasures. These are also the dreams and conversations that I hear with my own children every day. Although it seems to me that life in a boarding school should be somehow different, with its own specific themes and processes. It was then that I truly realized that we are all children of the earth and that we are equally valued and loved by Mother Earth. Another subjective reason that makes it difficult to build a more inclusive society is the existing, unfortunately deliberate violation of basic human rights. There are many explanations for this, as well as the forms of the violations. Someone bullies a person with special needs, considering him or her to be of lower level, and therefore without rights or accustomed to humiliation. Someone reduces funding for an institution with people with disabilities when distributing funds, arguing that these children do not need resources. Someone else deliberately saves spending money on a barrier-free infrastructure for people with limited mobility, arguing that they should stay at home instead of hanging out outside, disturbing other people. Unfortunately, there are still enough examples of the violations of the rights of individual members of our society, which impose additional requirements on the actions of organizations such as ours. Since I represent Ukraine, I cannot help but mention the most brutal violation of human rights that our society can experience: the war. War is essential evil. There is nothing more senseless than war. The mass destruction of one's own kind cannot have any justification, despite the fact that you may have heard about events in Ukraine. Given that many of you are unfamiliar with our country, I will allow myself to point out several facts related to the current situation. First of all, although Russia calls its aggression a special military operation, avoiding the word war, in fact it's a full-fledged and very cruel war, which is the largest in its scale in the history of mankind since the Second World War. More military equipment is currently involved in hostilities on the territory of Ukraine than in all other countries of Europe put together. Every day, Russians fire 60,000 shells at Ukrainians. You can only imagine what a fire hurricane it is and what consequences it brings. In addition, about 4,000 missiles have already been launched on the territory of Ukraine. Phosphorus and cluster bombs, prohibited by international conventions, are widely used. There are a growing number of young and beautiful people without limbs who can be seen on the streets of Ukrainian cities, towns and villages. It is especially painful to see children with such mutilations. I am not even talking about death of the civilian population. The numbers are terrible. Kharkiv, a city populated by over 1 million inhabitants, has already been destroyed by a third, and Mariupol, which has a population of several hundred thousand, is almost completely destroyed. And these are many such examples. Because of the war, about 8 million Ukrainians left their homes and moved to safer regions of Ukraine, although they can consider themselves safe only tentatively, since the range of Russian missiles is bigger than the territory of Ukraine, so all regions have been struck. Another 6.5 million Ukrainians fled abroad. Thus, almost 15 million people have lost everything they had and are forced to start over with no resources. The situation is even worse in the occupied territories. Today, about 20% of the territory of Ukraine is occupied by the Russian military. For you to realize how much it is, I will say that it is an area that could accommodate half of Germany or mainland Italy. You can hear what it's like to live in occupation from any news feed from Ukraine. In the summer, all news agencies wrote about atrocities in the towns of Bucha and Irpin, where bodies of hundreds of civilians tortured to death were found. Ukrainians suffer repressions in occupied towns and villages, but accurate information is not coming from there easily. In particular, about 1,500 bodies have already been identified in the Kiev region, which was partially occupied for less than 2 months. It is terrible to think what is happening in the territories where the Russian army has been staying for 6 months. Those who follow the news will have heard about the Ukrainian city of Izum, recently liberated by the Ukrainian army, where hundreds of graves were discovered with the bodies of tortured civilians, regardless of age and gender. There are hundreds of such towns throughout Ukraine. Since most of you have never been to Ukraine, so that you understand how horrible these things are for us, I will say that there have been no armed conflict in Ukraine since the World War II. We did not wage any war, as any country in Western Europe did not. Ukrainians lived, dreamt, made plans, developed their country. Of course, some things in Ukraine need improvement, but there is also undeniable progress. So as to demonstrate the level of our development, I can say that I can quickly and easily open a bank account on my smartphone, deposit funds there, and instantly transfer them to any corner of the world. Our stores are open around the clock, and many have already switched from card payments to biometric payments. Although Ukraine is the largest country by area in Europe, I can send a delivery to any settlement in our country within 1 day, and the registration will take 1 or 2 minutes. Ukraine became the first country in the world where the sale of real estate became possible with the help of smart contracts and the blockchain database, and technically it is carried out instantly. All I'm saying is that Ukraine is a highly developed, densely populated country where even a minor violation of human rights can cause public outrage, and these terrible atrocities that are happening now could not until now appear even in a nightmare. This one again proves that the line between life in a humane, human-centered society and the torrent of war and chaos is quite thin. Therefore, we all must constantly stand guard over the fundamental, time-honored human values, and purpose of such conferences as ours today is to constantly remind ourselves of this. Returning to the topic of inclusion and human rights, I want to underline that it is much easier to violate the rights of an individual than an organized community. In the latter case, the community transforms from being an object of violated rights to the subject of their definition and control. Therefore, it is extremely important to contribute towards the organization of communities, to increase their public activities, to support their training and involvement in all processes taking place within society. By the way, for the first time in the post-Soviet space, under the leadership of inclusive practices on the basis of the university that I lead, we now run specialist training for bachelor's and master's degrees in the field of community development. This involves implementing the international standards for community development practices produced by IACD. It will be possible to learn more about this later during our conference. Summing up my speech, which may have been a little emotional and therefore not very structured, I want to stress out that no matter how useful and professional the actions of individual people are in the field of inclusion, it is possible to talk about an inclusion society only if various communities are involved in the process. Only after these conditions is there a chance to significantly change the situation for the better. The same applies to the development of society as a whole. The United Nations Global Sustainable Development Goals can only be achieved through collaboration and joint efforts, although, of course, the contribution of each of us should not be underestimated either. Therefore, I will conclude my speech with the popular expressions in Ukraine: think globally, act locally. I wish all participants of the conference fruitful cooperation, new partnership and friendships. It's my honor to invite you to Ukraine, where peace is established here. Thank you all.